The Hebrew calendar. How did the children of Israel know what day it was? And did it matter? The why. Why did they need to know what day it was? There's a number of scriptures. I'm just going to go through. These aren't the only scriptures that are relevant. They aren't comprehensive, but they're hopefully enough to give us an idea of why this was important to them. So in Numbers chapter 10, verse 10, also in the day of your gladness and in your solemn days and in the beginnings of your months, you shall blow with trumpets over your burnt offerings and over your sacrifices, etc. They had to celebrate a feast, special sacrifices at the beginning of their months. And down the bottom, and in the beginning of your months, you shall offer a burnt offering, and so on. It was important for them to identify the beginning of a month. It was also important to find their feasts. And I guess it's worth just thinking, we assume we've got calendars on the wall and they're all set out and you can get a calendar for any year and things you like. That didn't exist at this stage. No one had that sort of thing. They had to do it all in some other way, and that's what we'd be talking about. So the Passover. The Lord spoke unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months, and it shall be the first month of the year, and so on and so on. And then they shall take unto them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house. And then a little bit further on, and you shall keep that lamb until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation shall kill it in the evening. So they had to know when to do this. They had to be able to repeat this year after year. So they had to have some means of keeping time. In Deuteronomy, it's talking about the same festival. Observe the month of Abib. So this month had a name. And it's interesting that, as far as we can tell in the Bible, before they went to Babylon, only 3 of their months had names. The rest were just numbers. So this one's given the month Abib. And keep the Passover of the Lord, for in the month of Abib the Lord thy God brought thee forth out of Egypt by night. And in the 14th day of the first month is the Passover, and in the 15th day of this month is the feast. 7 days shall unleavened bread be eaten. So we've got the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the very specific days that these have to be celebrated on. They had to know when those days were. The festival of the first fruits. Speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, When you be come into the land which I give unto you, and you shall reap the harvest thereof, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. They couldn't do this until they went into the promised land. This was before they got there. But they were told when they got to the promised land, they had to have a feast, a sacrifice of the first fruits. It's sometimes called a wave sacrifice. They had to take a sheaf of the first of the crop and sacrifice that as part of this celebration. So they had to know when that was. This isn't tied to a month. This is tied to a season. This is a different time scale. Then you shall count from you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offerings, that's the first fruits offering that we've just talked about, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall ye number 50 days, and you shall offer a new meat offering unto the Lord. This is the Feast of Pentecost. So this is 7 weeks, and the day after the end of those 7 weeks, after the time of the offering of the first fruits. So they've got to be able to get all of this into their calendar and sort it out and do it in perpetuity. speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath. That's a holiday, a feast day, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. That means a Sabbath, a high day, a high Sabbath. That's the Feast of Trumpets. Also on the 10th day of this 7th month, there shall be a day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation unto you, and you shall afflict your souls and make an offering made by fire unto the Lord. So this is the Day of Atonement, when they had the scapegoats and so on. That was a very specific day. Then again in verse 34, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. They had to live in booths, sometimes called the Feast of Booths. They made little cubby houses and lived in those for a week. I suspect the kids loved it and the adults hated it, but never mind. Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered the fruit of the land, you shall keep a feast unto the Lord 7 days. On the 1st day shall be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day shall be a Sabbath. So this is the time that they had to live in their tabernacles. But it says after they'd gathered all the fruit. So all the harvest had to be finished by this time. So this 7th month had to be coordinated with the end of the harvest. So that we've got these feasts. In the first month, there was the feast of Passover, unleavened bread and first fruits, which was in fact the barley harvest. On the 3rd month, that was 50 days after the first fruits, was Pentecost, and that happened to coincide with the wheat harvest, and there were some things that associated with that. Then in the 7th month, they had the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles, and by then the harvest was complete, and that included the wine and the oil harvest. All of that was completed at the Feast of the Tabernacles. And because these were laws, they had to know how to keep them. They were under law. They saw their worship, their praise of God was very legalistic. And if it's legalistic, this had to be defined somehow. They had to know how it all worked. We know that their months were defined by the new moon. We had that, the very first things. They have a feast on the day of the first moon. But there were also festivals related to the seasons. The seasons are defined by the sun, the years going around. Whatever system they came up with had to be able to be projected year after year after year. And it's the resolving of that that is what we're talking about. So what have we got to do all this stuff? We're sitting there in the middle of the desert trying to work out when we have these feast days. We haven't got a calendar. Our phones don't tell us the time yet. All we've got really are astronomical observations of some sort or another. And we can count days. So we know that the Earth rotates on its axis once a day. Fairly obvious, but that gives us days. We call them 24 hours. That day was defined from sunset through the night, through the day to the next sunset. And that's the way the Egyptians did it. The Hebrews followed that. And in Genesis, you'll find that every time they talk about it, it says, and the evening and the morning were the something day, in this case the 3rd day. The implication is that in Genesis it defines a day as being an evening first, then the day. So that's the days. We've got days. They're straightforward. This is all pretty basic stuff, but we need to just understand what we've got available. The Earth goes around the sun once a year, and that's technically called a Julian year. That doesn't matter, but there are other sorts of years that people come up with. We call that 365 and a quarter days. the Earth's tilted, the Earth's axis is tilted, and I'm sure we've all done this at school at some stage, and we get the seasons as the Earth goes around, and there are two equinoxes, which are when the day and night have exactly equal lengths. There's one up there, and the other one is down here. So there's an autumn and a spring equinox, equal day and night. Then there is also the solstices, when the sun appears to stand. If you notice, the sun gets further south in summer where we are. It rises further south and rises further north in winter. Extremes of those are the solstices, where the sun stops and starts going back the other way, and in halfway through is the equinox. They would have observed those, and those are important. What about our months? Well, the moon goes around the Earth, and it takes 27 and a bit, roughly 27 and a half days to actually go around the Earth once. If you line the moon up with a star a long way away, that's 27 and a half days. It's this time down here. These two lines, that one and that one, going off to a distant star, should be parallel, but the paper wasn't big enough. The moon has made one orbit of the Earth and it gets back to here. But in that time, the Earth has moved on roughly a twelfth of its whole orbit around the sun. So that when you look at the moon against the sun, it takes an extra 2 days for the moon to get back in line between the Earth and the sun. So there's the 29 and a half day month, which is called the synodic month. The names don't mean anything, that's not important at all, but the important thing is that a lunar month, in terms of an observer sitting on the Earth, looking at the moon in relation to the sun, because that's what defines the phases of the moon, it's 29 and a half days. The other one is interesting from tides, but we won't go anywhere near that at this stage. 29 and a half days is what the moon is observed to give us. This is what the moon looks like through those 29 and a half days. So each of these pictures roughly represents 3 days. They had to find the new moon, which is, the moon is exactly between the Earth and the sun, so all you can see is just the circle around. And then it starts to get its crescent and it goes on till the full moon, and then it shrinks back down to just before the new moon. So they could observe this. This gave them some means of getting at a lunar month. Using lunar months based on the new moon gives you a month which is either 29 or 30 days. A month has to be an even number of days. You can't have a month that's 29 and a half days long. It doesn't work. That means that a lunar year turns out to be 354 days. That's 12 times the 29 and a half. The Islamic calendar uses that still. They have either 354 or 355. They stick a leap day in every now and then. The problem is that that year is not as long as a solar year. So if you use lunar months, the seasons shift on your calendar. You can't use the seasons to fix things in that set of months because the seasons shift. And you may have noticed that in the Islamic world, Ramadan is fixed in their lunar calendar, but in our calendar it keeps shifting. It's a different time every year. It shifts by about a month or half a month. Every year the feast of Ramadan in the Islamic calendar shifts, and it gradually moves right through the year. So sometimes they're fasting in the middle of winter, sometimes they're fasting in the middle of summer, depending on where they are in their cycle. That won't work for the Hebrew calendar because they've got all these feasts that are tied to the seasons. They've got to have them occurring at the same time in the year relative to the sun. So they had to find a way of matching their lunar days to their solar year. So what does the Bible give us in terms of how to do this? It turns out not very much, but we'll have a look at what is there. This is one of the references in Genesis about the story of Noah. It says that in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. It started to rain. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And they all got in the ark and went off on their cruise. And then in chapter 8, and the waters returned from the earth continually. It had stopped raining, the waters came settled. And after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. So we've got 5 months, from the 17th of the 2nd month to the 17th of the 7th month. There are 5 months. And it says that's 150 days. So the Bible is saying that a month is 30 days. There are other references which give that as well. This is almost in passing, but is another one of the references to time in the Bible. After the number of days in which you searched the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall you bear your iniquities, even 40 years, and you shall know my breach of promise. This is where we get the idea that one day is a year. One day represents a year in Bible prophecy, and we know that that's used in a number of cases around the place, but this is where it comes from. There are other less explicit references, but that's one. In Revelation, it says, the woman fled into the wilderness. She has a place prepared of God that they should feed her there 1,260 or 60 days. Then a bit later on, the same thing, and it says, and she's nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. We're told that 1,260 days is equal to 1 plus 2 plus a half times. And if you divide 1,260 by 3.5, you get 360 days, which is 12 times 30. So we've got a month in Bible time, there's 30 days. Put 12 of those together, you get a 360-day prophetic year, it's called. It's not used for anything other than times, as far as I can work out. But the Bible has a number of prophecies that talk about times, the 7 times punishment. This is the time that they're referring to. So there's layers of different units in the Bible. So how did they deal with this? What was the answer to all of this? They counted the days in their months. And on the 30th day of each month, the Sanhedrin, that's the ruling committee, if you like, or body of the Jewish or the Hebrew priests, would call for witnesses. Had anybody seen the new moon? And to make sure that they got credible witnesses, they actually put on a bit of a feast for them. They come in and have a big meal. But those witnesses were asked pretty specifically, where did you see the new moon? What did the new moon look like? What time of day or night did you see it? They knew roughly when it was going to turn up. They knew where it would turn up. And they knew what it should look like. So they interrogated these witnesses to make sure that it was real. Once they had satisfied themselves that the new moon had appeared, they declared or sanctified a new month. So that day, when they'd got the new moon, was the 1st day of the new month. The previous month was declared closed, and they decided that it only had 29 days because they'd just done this on the 30th day. So you didn't know how long a month was until it ended. So if your birthday was going to be on the 30th day of that month, tough. It didn't happen. If no witnesses turned up on the 30th day, then the next day, which was the 31st day, was automatically declared the first day of the new month, meaning that the previous month had 30 days. So they made it up as they went along, in broad terms. If you lived out in the country or a long way from Jerusalem, because all this is happening in the temple, you had to know when the new month happened, because when the new month happened, you had to have a feast. And you had to start counting days for other feasts and things. So they used to light fires. Jerusalem, they'd light a fire, and then the next hill they could see would light a fire, and they could transfer this message by the fire signals or messengers to the towns close by where they could get the message to them. That's not a foolproof system. Sometimes, due to the weather, they couldn't see the new moon. They couldn't let the months go on. They couldn't have 30 day after 30 day after 30 day months. They had to allow some of them to be 29 days, but they couldn't have a 29 day month until they saw the new moon. So they had these other rules that they weren't allowed to have less than 4 or more than 8 full months. It's not clear how they dealt with all of that, but that was their problem, not ours. The fact of the matter is their calendar was fluid and adjustable. Originally there was no fixed calendar. Each month the Sanhedrin would determine whether that month would contain 29 or 30 days, depending on when the following month's new moon was first sighted. Then they had other rules in there to avoid feast day Sabbaths occurring adjacent to their weekly Saturday Sabbaths. Apparently it was because they didn't have decent fridges, they couldn't keep food, and those sorts of things. They couldn't have 2 Sabbaths hard up against one another. They had to have a day in between. So they had to adjust their calendar. So all of these 29 and 30 day rules had some wriggle room in there. Before the temple was destroyed in AD 70, there were some rules. The new moon cannot occur before a lapse of 29 and a half days. That was part of their querying the witnesses. If the moon could not be exactly determined, one month was to have 30 and the next one 29. So the odd and even months were given 30 or 29 days through the time. So that the year could not be less than 352 or more than 356, which you'll notice has already got a fair bit of leeway in there, but it still doesn't get them up to 365, which is what they need to get their calendar to work with the solar months. The fire signals weren't always reliable, and there were times when the Samaritans, who sit between Jerusalem and Babylon or Jerusalem and Galilee, used to light fires at the wrong time just to confuse the system, so that the people who were depending on these fire signals for their new month and their festival got the wrong information. Just a little bit of protest, surreptitious stirring, I think. Also, the messengers didn't do very well. There were lots of communities outside Judea after the exile, including some in Babylon, and they wouldn't know when a new month had begun because they couldn't get the signal in time. Obviously trouble with mobile coverage in those days. To cover all the possibilities, they would celebrate every holiday for 2 days instead of 1. The day the holiday would have been if there were 29 days, and the holiday would be if they had 30 days. I guess if that was your birthday, you got 2. That still happens today in the Jewish system. There are still Jewish communities away from Jerusalem celebrate the feasts for 2 days, not 1, because it's a leftover from this uncertainty, but that was how they dealt with it. Every 2 or 3 years, An extra month was intercalated. I've left that word in there. I'd never heard it before. I think it means interred into the calendar. You intercal something. You stick another month into the calendar. Like a leap year is intercalated. I love that. Anyway, they sort of tried to work out when that happened, and that is handed down through the patriarchal people. But the critical time was this month of Nisan. When they went to Babylon, they came back with Babylonian names for the months. And the month Abib, which was one of the ones that was named in Moses' time, was renamed Nisan, the first month. And that was fixed by the barley being ripe. But it was also related to what's called the vernal or the spring equinox, because that gave them a fixed time every year to start their calendar. The first new moon after the spring in the Northern Hemisphere equinox, they would start their calendar, restart it. And if that had slipped too far, they'd stick in another month to keep it in the right order. And that's how they fixed Easter these days in modern Christian church. It's the first Sunday after the full moon following the equinox, the autumn equinox for us, the spring equinox in the Northern Hemisphere. That's where it comes from. So they'd stick this extra month in, and the 12th month was called Adar. So they'd stick this extra month in called Adar Shenai, or Adar 2. And on the evening before they'd do that, the high priests would have a committee meeting and then announce it. People didn't know when their new year was going to start until New Year's Day, because it might be New Year's Day, it might be the first of this second month. They didn't know until it happened. So their calendar was not only flexible, but changed. The first month of the religious year is month number 1, called Nisan. The civil year, that's the year that they have for their, these days, their taxes, your car registration, those sort of things, starts on month number 7, called Tishri, which is the month that's got the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles in it. But that's in the middle of the year in terms of the religious celebration. But it means they have 2 New Year's days. And that probably means 2 New Year's Eves, so that could be part of why they do that. By about 300 AD, they knew enough about the astronomy to fix their calendar. They could predict all of this stuff ahead, so the calendar got fixed about then. And that's all laid out now and sorted. And they know when these leap months are going to happen and so on. So this is what that calendar looks like. Interestingly enough, a year can be 6 different lengths. So it can be 353, 354, 355 if it's a normal year, depending on whether these 2 months each have 29, one has 29 and one has 30, or they both have 30. And they use that to adjust as they go along. These days they know it in advance. They wouldn't have known it in advance prior to about 300 AD. And so on. It's all just adjusted to work. But it means that each year is different. There's a 19-year cycle that repeats, but from year to year, the years have different numbers of days, and the feasts are on different days of the week and so on. On top of all of that, there were these other cycles. Every 7th day is a Sabbath, a day of rest. That's 10 Commandments. That's the ordinary weekly cycle. Every 7th year is a Sabbath year. That's a year of rest for the land. A fallow year. They didn't take any crops off the land every 7th year. And after 7 cycles of 7 years, the following year was a Sabbath year called Jubilee. This is where the Jubilee comes from. It's 7 times 7, and it's the one after that. That gets them a 50-year cycle, which fits in with the 100-year centuries and so on. What does this mean for us? Well, in Romans, Paul says one man esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. It's up to you. He that regards the day regards it unto the law. And he that regards not the day to the Lord, he doth not regard it. We're not bound by these really very, very rigid timekeeping and festivals and so on. My take on that is that we've got the Holy Spirit. We commune with God. We know where God is every day, all day. The children of Israel needed reminding. They needed something in their lives to bring God into their memory. And a ritual, a set of rituals, a set of fixed, ongoing, perpetual celebrations, if you like, was what reminded them that God was in their life. They didn't have the contact, the relationship with God, which we've got. So when Jesus said he has fulfilled the law, he says we don't need this rigid, rigorous set of dates and times. We don't need that. Every day have we got the existence and presence of God in our lives. I think we need to understand the origins of some of these things, particularly those related to Bible prophecy, where they come from, how they are applied. I think also there is this relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament and the life of Jesus. We celebrate Jesus as the Paschal Lamb. We celebrate the forgiveness of sins associated with the Day of Atonement. We don't celebrate the Day of Atonement. We don't celebrate the Passover. We celebrate the outcome of those feasts in our lives. And we celebrate the coming of the Holy Spirit. We don't have a celebration on Pentecost because it's real to us every day, not on a specific day. It also helps us to understand the correct timing of the death and resurrection of Christ. We may have seen this before. This is Passover week in the month of Nisan, according to the Jewish calendar, but with our day names set on side and how it fits into our calendar. So on the Saturday, the 10th day of the first month, they take the lamb and set it aside. That corresponds to Palm Sunday in our wording, but that's the day that Jesus entered Jerusalem. The lamb was then kept through that week. On the 14th day, they had to prepare the Passover feast. The lamb was killed and prepared, and they ate the Passover meal. In our understanding, that's the Last Supper, and Jesus was crucified on that day. He died and he was buried before the end of that day, the 14th day. The Thursday, the 15th day, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's a high Sabbath. They could do no work. Jesus had to be buried before that day started. On the 16th day of that month was an ordinary working day. That was the day the women could go out and buy the spices and things and get them prepared. Then the Saturday was an ordinary weekly Sabbath. They couldn't do any work. They couldn't go around on that day. And on the Sunday is the sheaf of the first fruits, the waving festival. And that was the day when they discovered Jesus resurrected. So there are 3 days and 3 nights between the 14th, the end of the 14th day and the beginning of the 18th day. There's 3 days. Jesus was in the ground. 3 days and nights. These days, the gaps in the Sabbaths and things are all set by the rules for the Hebrew calendar. And I came across this diagram, which I quite liked, except they got the days and nights wrong. They got the right pictures. They got a day in the Hebrew thing, starts in the evening and then the daylight is the second part of the day. They got the pictures right, but if you can see underneath my overwriting, they had day and night the wrong way around. So rather than throw the picture away, I thought it was a good illustration of how it all worked. It highlights the Last Supper and the Passover. So that's the evening of the Wednesday. The day of the Wednesday, Jesus was crucified and buried before sundown. So Jesus is in the ground. This day is the high Sabbath. That's the day after the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Friday was an ordinary working day. Jesus is still in the tomb. The spices were purchased. The Saturday was an ordinary Sabbath. Jesus is still buried. But he rises before sunrise. But that actually applies on this day. So there's 1, 2, 3 days. Jesus is resurrected on this day. 3 nights and 3 days, which is what the scriptures say, but not what the modern Christian calendar talks about. This has to fit in with the Hebrew calendar, which is why it has some relevance and some importance. This is a little bit of supposition, but if you've glazed over already, keep glazed. But this is, I think, quite interesting. This is a diagram of where the sun rises relative to north, and this is in the northern hemisphere, which is where Jerusalem is. Sunrise starts up here, comes down to in winter, it's rising south of east. In the summer, it's rising north of east. And the equinox, it's in the middle. So the sun moves. It's moving north or south. It's very slow at either end, but quite fast through the middle. We know that the Egyptians and the Babylonians used the observation of the sun, solstices and equinox, so it's very likely that the Hebrews did as well. There are suggestions there's a thing called the Book of Enoch, which has got all sorts of astronomical stuff in it, but it's very difficult to actually understand what it's talking about, but it is talking about astronomical observations and things. And there are suggestions that Solomon's temple included features relating to the sun's movement. There's nothing in the Bible to suggest that but there is the suggestion that the 2 pillars on the porch of the temple, which would be located here and here, and they're called Jashin and Boaz, they might have been positioned so that they aligned with the summer sunrise at the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And that for an observer in the middle of the temple would just see the sun rising exactly next to those pillars. No evidence in the Bible. I couldn't find any other evidence for that. The Freemasons tend to use this for their alignment of some of their stuff, but I thought it was an interesting possibility. The porch of the temple faced east and was aligned quite accurately, as I understand it, to the east, and sunrise at the equinox would be due east, right in the middle of those 2 pillars. So if you had someone with a staff standing, let's say, for supposition, a mark on the floor, exactly the middle of those 2 pillars, the shadow of that staff would run straight into the middle of the temple, straight down through the main door into the middle of the temple. And around the equinox, the rising sun is moving across the horizon from one day to the next by about its own diameter. It's moving quite fast. So you could get it to within a day or 2 quite easily, and probably better than that. But it means the date of the equinox could be fixed, and they could use that when they were determining whether to start their new year or to stick another month in, because they'd know where it was. Again, there's nothing in the Bible to talk about that, but it's knowledge that was common through the Babylonians and the Egyptians, who would have had influence on the culture and the knowledge that the children of Israel had, particularly after the exile. It's common knowledge right through all the henges and things in Northern Europe. Stonehenge and all of those other places are all lining these sorts of things up and are astronomical observatories. So it's very likely that that was part of the things they used, but we don't know. So the Hebrews of the Old Testament times had a calendar based on lunar months, which was variable and adjusted to keep it in line with the solar year. And it was a vital part of their religious observances. They had to know what day it was, but they didn't really know what day it was, if you see what I mean. It helps us to understand the events in the New Testament. And the Bible doesn't have a lot of detail, but it does specify the units used in prophecies and the dates and times of the religious festivals. Thank you.